Okay, well, so everybody, welcome to this next webinar in the HELE series, HELE Webinar series, History of English Language Education webinar series, which we have begun. I'm going to go straight in to introduce our speaker today, who is Dr. Cheeloo. And I know Dr. Cheeloo very well because she did her PhD under my supervision at the University of Warwick. My name is Richard Smith, and she has been invited to talk about English education in missionary schools in 19th to 20th century China, which was the topic of her PhD. So she is now, after gaining her PhD, she is an associate professor at Soochow University of International Studies and Trade in China, where she is specializing in the history of English language education in 19th and early 20th century China within missionary institutions in her research. She's published an article with Wei Chen in the journal Language and History, and she's had another one accepted recently for the same journal, co-authored with me. So over to you, Cheeloo. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your introduction, Richard, and good evening, everyone from China, and good afternoon, depending where you are joining from. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. And so I will directly to begin my presentation. So I would like to begin this talk with a story, like a very familiar story, I believe, at least in China. That's in much Chinese scholarship of especially 1980s to 1990s. Missionary schooling was described as a form of cultural invasion, and the English teaching they conducted as something close to linguistic invasion. And that language has not disappeared. In popular discussions online today, one still reads that English like colonized Chinese education through the missionary schools. And at the same time, within the framework of linguistic imperialism associated with a concept called linguistics. The spread of English through missionary schooling appears as an act of cultural displacement, a word will imposed from above. And now this story is not observed. English did spread through missionary schools, and missionaries did want to Christianize China, but the story was built on secondary sources and then kind of ideological readings, with remarkably little attention to what actually happened inside the classroom, inside the teaching practice. And when we go into the archives, when we look at the curricula, timetables, some meeting minutes, and students' diary, a far more complicated and I think far more interesting picture emerges. And so let me state my argument at the outside, like in one sentence. English language education in Protestant missionary institutions in China was not an act of imposition. It was kind of more like a negotiated outcome, negotiated among missionaries, students, parents, the government, and broader social economic forces. The talk follows three words of my title. First, the debates, a nearly 30-year argument within the missionary community over whether English should be taught at all. Secondly, the practices, how three universities, first St. John's in Shanghai and Soochow University in Suzhou and Cheeloo University in Shandong, answered that question in three very different ways. And the third, the legacies. What this history leaves behind, both for China and for how we write the history of language teaching. A brief word first on sources and method, because everything I will say rests on all of them. And this research draws on primary sources gathered from 6 archives in China and the United States. Among them, the Shanghai Municipal Archives, the Soochow Municipal Archives, and the Soochow University Archives, and the Shandong Provincial Archives, and the Presbyterian Historical Society in America. Alongside the archival records, I have worked with the published records of the general conferences of Protestant missionaries held in Shanghai in 1877 and 1890. The triennial reports of China Christian Educational Association, the annual reports of individual colleges, missionary correspondence and diaries, and student publications such as the St. John's Echo. Methodologically, this is practice-oriented history of language learning and teaching, in the sense that Richard and others had advocated, and attempt to reconstruct not only policies and ideas, but curricula, textbooks, examinations, and classroom routines, what teachers and students actually did. Where the sources allow, I also pay biographical attention to some individual educators because, as I hope to show, individuals also mattered. And why does this matter? Because the existing account of missionary English education in China has leaned heavily on kind of unverified secondary materials, and ideology has often stood in for evidence. And the archive gives us a way to test the imposition narrative against the practice, and practice may tell another story. Okay, so let me set the scene quickly because the prehistory contains a surprise. English teaching for Chinese learners did not begin in China. It began outside it, beyond reach of the Qing Empire, which at that time banned both Christian missions and the teaching of Chinese to foreigners. In 1818, Robert Morrison, the first Protestant missionary to China, founded the Anglo-Chinese College in Malacca. Stated object was, in Morrison's words, the reciprocal cultivation of Chinese and European literature, like Chinese for Europeans and English with European literature and science for what he called the nations who read Chinese. From its very foundation, this pioneering institution was a kind of bilingual institution, not as one-way transmission of English. And then the Morrison School in Macau followed in 1835, which began to conduct a practice that put more emphasis on English education. Here is the surprise. When the treaty ports opened after 1842 and missionaries finally entered the mainland China, most of the schools they founded did not teach English. They taught in Chinese and about Chinese. The reasons were partly evangelical. A future Chinese evangelist needed literacy and standing in his own language and his own community. And they were also partly practical. Missionaries feared that students with English English competence would simply leave school for a well-paid job in a foreign firm. Some schools that tried English, like an early boarding school in Fuzhou, for example, actually finally withdrew it. And the first missionary school on the mainland to establish a formal English course was the Shanghai Anglo-Chinese School, opened in 1865 under a young headmaster named John Fryer, much better known today as a translator of scientific texts and a pioneer of Chinese studies in the United States. His school ran 4 tightly organized hours of English every morning. He grouped pupils by the variety of Chinese they spoke. He made extensive use of translation in both directions, and there were strikingly little Christian content in his English lessons. There was certainly no English-only curriculum, and as a human footnote, Fryer confessed in a private letter that he was, as quoted here, perfectly sick of teaching English. The people in this history were individuals with their own frustrations and ambitions. They were not the disciplined agents of a kind of monolithic project. By the 1870s, then two forces were colliding. Growing commercial demand for English in the treaty ports and deep missionary caution about what English would do to mission schools. Out of that collision came a debate, a public, sustained, and sometimes even sharp debate that ran for nearly 30 years. And this debate opened at the first General Conference of Protestant Missionaries of China, held in Shanghai in 1877, and it ran through the Second General Conference in 1890 and the triennial meetings of the China Christian Educational Association in the 1890s, with echoes as late as 1905. Broadly, it's moved through 3 stages. First, a beginning stage from 1877, and a climactic stage around 1890 to 1895, and a closing stage from 1896. And the case against English was made most forcefully by a name called Calvin Mateer, an American Presbyterian who had founded a school at Dongzhou in Shandong province in 1864. And please remember his name because his institution will return in the second half of this talk. And for Mateer, it seemed, as he put it in 1890, in the last degree natural, that education in China should be in the Chinese language. His 2 central objections deserve to be taken seriously. First, a student who acquired English would enter the market which pays so well for his acquirements in English and be lost to the church. Second, studying 2 languages at once would compromise the student's Chinese. And he argued a Chinese preacher who is poor scholar in his own language can never be a man of wide and varied influence. By the way, the geography of the argument also should be noted that opposition to English tended to come from inland and northern educators in regions with little demand of English, and the support tended to come from the treaty ports. So, on the other side, a younger generation of missionaries in the port cities, like standing on their own arguments, like Chinese, they believe still lacked a settled scientific terminology. So English opened the door to modern language, modern knowledge. And English broadened students' minds and encouraged independent thinking. And the Qing government itself was moving towards English, and it has been a success from their perspective. A person who called Franklin Ollinger supplied the debate's most memorable image. He said, like, granting that English might carry dangers as well as benefits, he asked, who would abolish the Pacific Ocean because it floats pirates as well as merchantmen and gunboats? And the German missionary Ernst Faber declared flatly that English was to be the language of the East. But the voice I would most like you to hear from this debate is a Chinese one. At the Educational Association meeting of 1896, the discussion was summed up on the winning, like a pro-English side by a Chinese pastor and a senior figure at St. John's in Shanghai called Yan Yongjing. Yan recalled that in the early days of St. John's, when English was not taught, no boys came except the poor, who had to be given food, clothing, and free tuition to come at all. While a rival school, also in the same city, Shanghai, filled its enrollment because it offered English. In order to maintain our existence, he said, we had to follow suit. And he added his own judgment as an educator. He said, like, the learning of English quickens students' mind. And I want to pause on that moment. That statement delivered by a Chinese educator explained that Chinese families and students had voted their feet. The single thing already complicates any picture of English being forced upon an unwilling population. And by 1896, then the supporters of English had kind of won, but it was a victory with texture. Even Mathieu conceded that that year that he had never placed himself on record as opposite to teach English, and that under proper conditions he was far from opposite. The consensus was a spectrum, not a switch. Whether, when, how much, and through which medium English should be taught remained matters for each institution to work out. And that is where the real story begins in practice. Okay, let me now let me now take you to three universities founded by people in different sides of that debate and show you how differently the same question was answered on the ground and how the answer kept being renegotiated. We will begin from Shanghai at St. John's College or St. John's University. In later decades, the most famous English medium institution in China. What is easily forgotten is that St. John's did not start that way. When the American Episcopal Church founded the college in 1879, instruction was in Chinese, first in Guanhua, then in the local Wu variety. And as we have just heard from Yan Yongjing, recruitment was struggle. The turning point came in October 1881 when, in response to demand from Cantonese merchant families residents in Shanghai, the college opened an English department with 12 students and 2 teachers and a monthly fee of 6 taels of silver, a fee that's effectively selected for like a wealthy families. And this kind of demand grew quickly as Yan said, once English was introduced, better classes of lace came in. The decisive figure was a man called Francis Lister Hawkspot, who arrived to lead English teaching in 1886 and became president in 1888. At the age of 24, and under Pot, St. John's built what I would describe as a complete English language ecology. And in the classroom, this means a careful graded 4-year preparatory curriculum, spelling, dictation, and sentence construction in the earlier years, as the writing and translation between Chinese and English in the later ones, with students finishing on literary texts such as like Robinson Crusoe and at the 1896 meeting, Polt argued that after 3 years of this preparation, students could study Western subjects entirely through English, and he practiced what he said. From 1896, the sciences and humanities courses at St. John's were all taught in English. And after the university registered in the United States in 1905, it modeled its curriculum on Columbia and imported original English textbooks. Beyond the classroom, in 1890, St. John's founded the St. John's Echo, the first students-run English newspaper in a modern Chinese university, with Paul himself as editor-in-chief. Its students' contributes included a young Lin Yutang, later one of the most celebrated bilingual writers of 20th century in China. And in 1898 came the English Literature Debating Society. And from 1913, inter-college English debates against the Soochow University, which we will introduce next, happened in this between these colleges. And two things are worth underlining. First, St. John's ambitions went beyond commercial English. Under the motto "Light and Truth," English literature was kind of explicitly harnessed to the formation of character, and Pope spoke of training the leaders in all reform movements. Cultural influence was certainly intended, but secondly, even the flagship of English medium education in China had adopted English in the first place as a response to enrollment pressure and to Shanghai labor market. The demand came from Chinese society, and the college followed, not the college leaded that trend. And our second stop is Soochow University. Founded in 1900 and 1901 by the Methodist Church source, a generation later than St. John's, after the debate had largely been settled. Its first president, David Anderson visited Port before opening the university and drew the lesson of the age. In China, he concluded, modern education can only be conducted in a modern language, which for us is English. So, Suzhou adopted English as its preferred medium of instruction, but and this is what makes Suzhou so interesting. Anderson wrote a kind of part into the university's founding regulation. No country in the world had ever abandoned its national language for another. The university would therefore weigh Chinese and Western courses equally, and the students' excellence in English could never make up weaknesses in China, and nor the reverse. Neither could be sacrificed, no matter English or Chinese. And in the preparatory stage of this university, time was divided evenly between Chinese and English. The Chinese curriculum ran for 6 years in the affiliated middle school, exactly parallel to English, with both written and spoken tracks, regular composition, memorization, and examinations. Suzhou University was consciously producing graduates who could carry knowledge in both directions between Chinese and English. And by the 1920s, it stood alongside St. John's as a leading missionary university of Eastern China. If St. John's shows us English immersion answer, Suzhou University shows us the both and answer institutionalized in practice. Chinese and English education were not treated as opposite. And our third story. Our third story is the most dramatic one, and it takes us back to Calvin Matier mentioned before and Shandong province. Matier's school was at Dengzhou. founded in 1864 and later expanded into a college, was everything his speeches promised. Instruction in Chinese, a curriculum that embraced the Confucian classics taught by local scholars, and in the formal plan he submitted in 1881, the stipulation that the Chinese language be the medium of instruction throughout the course, English being taught only as an actual in special cases. In practice, no English course existed at all, and its successor institutions would keep Chinese medium instruction as a point of pride. Um, its prospectus later advertised that from the first, the university had made a special point of teaching China's youngs in their own tongue and not through the medium of English. But by the early 1900s, early 20th century, the world around the college had changed. After Qing government's defeats in 1895 and 1900, the study of Western knowledge revived with official blessing. Thousands of Chinese students were leaving to study abroad. At the peak, like around 13,000 in Japan alone. And student study abroad required foreign language ability. In 1904, the Qing government's own regulation made English a principal subject in state higher schools. And graduates of the college, by then called Guangwen College, came back from jobs in other provinces, urging their juniors not to neglect English. And students began to ask a pointing question, um, which the college historian records in almost these words, like English was the mother tongue of Western faculty, but why were they unwilling to share it? And in February 1906, the college president, Paul Burgeon, put the situation to his board, to the college board. It was he wrote like whether the time had not arrived to introduce English, because as a matter of fact, both teachers and students were already studying it privately. He said like we find English alphabets wrote over blackboards. He also said, and scraps of paper flying about the campus containing attempts at English composition. Sooner or later, we will have to consider whether we are gaining anything by continuing postponing it. However, the board still chose postpone it. And on the 1st of November 1906, the students in Guangwen College went on strike. They presented 9 demands, and 2 aimed directly at the classroom. First, reform the old-style teaching with its corporal punishment, and introduce English courses. However, the authorities of the college response was harsh. The demand was denounced as insolent and dictatorial. The strike was broken within a week, and the 9 students were expelled and 9 more suspended. It can be said that the college had won. However, in reality, the pressure did not release. Finally, in February 1907, the board again rejected English even over the urging from its own mission board secretary in the New York City, and with material drafting the reply. But on the 26th of December 1907, the board reversed itself and voted to authorize English courses. English was open only to students in the 3rd year and above. Any students whose marks in other subjects fell below 80 will lost their right to continue to learn English. and students take English paid an extra 30 silver dollars a year. At the time when the entire annual bill for tuition and board was 30 silver dollars, which means double the tuition. And unsurprisingly, in 1909, out of 246 students, only 16 students took English education. And from constrained beginning, English at the Guangmen College and later Cheeloo University, which was emerged into Cheeloo University in 1917, grow slowly and under resources. For years, almost every foreign teacher and sometimes their wives and house guests were pressed into teaching English classes regardless of training. Yet, by 1926, the university had developed detailed English entrance requirements covering conversation, composition, vocabulary, and pronunciation, even as it retained and advertised the Chinese as its media of instruction. I hope the significance of this story is clear. At Cheeloo University, the roles assumed by the imposition narrative are exactly inverted. It was Chinese students who demanded English, even at the price of expulsion, and vast missionaries who resisted it. When English finally arrived, it arrived from below through student agency on terms negotiated inch by inch. If missionary English education were in linguistic aggression, will be a very strange way for aggression to behave. Okay. Finally, let me draw the threads together and return to my opening sentences. Across these three institutions and across the debates that preceded them, language policy emerges as the product of continuous negotiation among at least four parties. The missionaries themselves, who were divided and who changed, like Matier, the great opponent, ended his career requiring English of his own theological students. And secondly, students and parents who exercise the power through enrollment, through fees, and like in Guangwen, through open revolt. And thirdly, the state, whose 1904 regulations helped tip the balance and whose later Republican era requires continue to shape the schools. And finally, the market. The treaty port economy that made English valuable in Shanghai and nearly worthless in Shandong, which is why the same church could sustain an English immersion university in one place and a Chinese medium one in another. From this, two stereotypes need revising. First, missionary English education was not enforced linguistic aggression. Where Chinese demand was absent, missionaries taught Chinese often more zealously than the Chinese scholars themselves. Where English spread, it spread because Chinese local wanted it for their own reasons, like employment, study abroad, national strengthening. And second, Chinese and English were not bipolar opposites. The most English of these institutions, like St. John's, still adapted its Chinese provision, and the most Chinese one, Cheeloo University, also built up English courses. And Soochow University wrote the balance into its constitution. And what we see everywhere is rebalancing, not replacement. And lastly, then what are the legacies? I would name three. First, institutional and human legacies. These universities trained the first generations of Chinese professionals at home in English. Translators, editors, scientists, writers such as Lin Yutang, and they accumulated practical exercise experience that still looks familiar, like graded language curricula fitting into English medium instruction, entrance requirements specifying the four skills, debating societies and students' English journals. Anyone working on English medium instruction today would recognize these institutions' problems and some of their solutions. And secondly, a historiographical legacy. This history shows what primary sources make possible. The recovery of practice of individual biography and above all of Chinese agency as a corrective to both nationalist and imperialist master narratives. And also it invites comparison. And thirdly, a contemporary resonance. And the question these institutions faced in the 1890s, how to secure the utility of English as a global language without surrendering the values and identity carried by the mother tongue, is the question that language education policy in China and in many other countries is still negotiating today. History does not hand us answers, but it does show us that this balance has been struck before, not by imposition and not by exclusion, but by negotiation. And thank you very much for your attention. If you would like to read further my studies, collaborating with Richard and Dr. Chen Wei from Malta University on the related topic appeared in Language and History or on their way in the same journal. And I look forward to your questions, and I would be especially glad to from colleagues working on other contexts about the parallels and the contrasts. That's all. Thank you so much.
So, Cheeloo, thank you so much. You've got a bit of a cold, but it was a
Yeah.
great presentation. Um,
Mhm.
Very clear and compelling story that you've told. Well, history that you've related, let's say, because it reminded me of a quote. It's in French originally, but it's a good quote. I think it says that doing history or wanting to do history kind of begins when we realize that we've been told stories, we've been told not lies, but myths, certain myths. So that you began your
Yeah.
whole presentation in that way. I think you've shown very effectively how what you've been doing with primary sources sort of presents a counter narrative to very dominant ideas. And it kind of reminded me a bit of Parimala Rao's work in India with Macaulay, in relation to Macaulay. So I'd like to definitely, as you have done, invite our audience to relate what you've told to their own context. And we have many, of course, from India, but other places. And Krishna in the chat has actually said some from very early in your talk,
Okay.
when you were talking about the way English, or the introduction of English was negotiated and not sort of imposed. I think that's how he responded. But maybe Krishna or anybody would like to, if you would like to maybe compare with your own knowledge of your context, as Sheila would invite you to do, or respond in any way at all, please indicate. Please put up your hand or just open your microphone.
All right.
Well, I think Krishna might have,
Yeah, Amal, then, if you would like to comment.
sorry.
Oh, would you like to?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
was going to say that I also agree what Krishna has mentioned in the chat. And this is something that we discovered as we started our own studies into the history of English language teaching and learning in India. The prevalent widespread narrative believes it to be a tool in the colonial administration's attempt to impose itself. But in reality, we found that there were many examples where some of the colonial British officers themselves were against using English as a language or English as a medium, whereas the local people strongly demanded to learn English. In fact, there are hundreds of examples where schools were set up by mobilizing funds by local people, and they started their own schools. So this is something that resonates with our history as well, where English was not necessarily an imposition. In other words, calling English as an imposition is oversimplifying a very complex historical reality. That's what we felt.
Yeah, I totally agree with the point. It's that just to call English as an imposition or a kind of invasion is too simplified. We need to admit that it has kind of characteristic of like colonial and like yeah, but it's actually in a pretty complex situation in different contexts, no matter in China, in India, or in Africa. Yeah, it's also we need to have a look like how the locals who calling for a language that's like kind of labeled as a like a global or a modernized language, and they have the wish to strengthening themselves or maybe just earn money, but we need to see this kind of calling. Yeah.
Yes.
Uh,
It reminds
by the
me.
way, can I ask you how widespread was English in during the 19th century? Was it limited only to the port cities, as you suggested, seem to suggest?
Actually, it's not. It's a kind of a long timeline, like since 1840s when the like the missionary schools firstly introduced in China, in mainland China, until the established of the Chinese government, the new Chinese government, 1949. At the beginning, like during the 19th century, the English education were kind of limited. The spread of English were limited in the poor cities, business cities, but later it's like it transferred into the mainland China. But still, we cannot say that's like all of the Chinese province or regions have the taught of English until the like during the modern mass schooling and the Chinese government began to ask English became a compulsory course in different schools. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's. I think your study is showing the agency of people in China to in relation to English, and of course that's criticism. One critique of very important book, but debated book, which is Linguistic Imperialism by Robert Phillipson. And I remember at the time that book came out, there was a lot of debate about that book, and one argument against his overall thesis is that it doesn't talk about agency of the people locally. And I think as soon as you're in your study, you're looking much more at practice, you're looking at local context, and you're uncovering agency. And you're uncovering, as you said at the end, diversity across China, diversity of the introduction of English. And as soon as you start to look at local contexts with archives, etc., and get away from the overall ideology or the overall myth or narrative that we receive, I think you start to see diversity. I mean, Vanilla and I wrote an article about India, about a missionary educator in around Madras, and named John Murdoch, and that's what we were seeing. That there was a great diversity of types of institution, and you emphasized how once you start to look at this historically, you see how there are so many issues which are important about, when and how much English, at what age and what level, and there are so many different varieties of types of school and types of curriculum, which I think, yeah, as you said, I think it does provide interesting perspectives for current, present day English language education. Simon or Nick, oh wow, lots of comments in the chat. So I would invite Simon just to just to verbalize or oralize your comment. Simon.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, I have a problem with my camera at
Oh,
the moment.
okay.
Otherwise, I'd switch on.
Okay.
But yes, just to say that, yeah, it's a really interesting piece of work, and the focus of using primary sources. But it does, as you say, and others have said already, challenge these preconceptions of colonialism and the role of English in the past. So I'm wondering, now that you've got some part of your paper published and more on the way, what has the reaction been, especially in China itself, to this kind of challenge using these new historical sources? Thank you.
Actually, because my this work were like kind of newly published, I cannot say that I get a kind of immediate response from my my peers and colleagues in China. But I actually heard from I have heard some voice when I introduced my work to my colleagues, and they mainly fight. They are not actually, they are not feeling surprised. Like, it seems that people already know that. Yeah, we in the like the former perspectives, English were treated oversimplified. But like they said that yes, but when we published papers, we need to firstly admit that the English, the missionaries are like have the had their like colonial characteristic, and then you can mention their advantages, their progress and their modernization and something like that. This is a kind of yeah, mainstream in China, but we are allowed to say like that. We are allowed to discussion about these kind of primary sources, but we have to admit firstly the negative side of the English and negative side on English and missionary schools. And I'm not sure if what's your point of question is like, because I cannot see an immediate response from the scholarships in China, but from my perspective, the situation is like that.
Okay. Oh, that's Simon. Thank you. So what about Nick? I'll just say what he says here. Wonderful talk, but may I ask how important official encouragement of English was in leading to students demanding English? Would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, of course. I believe the we cannot see as a governmental or statement encouragement, because like no matter the chain government of the Republican governments, they never shows the kind of encouragement. But in their regulation, in their practice, they shows a interesting in English, because the reformer in the governments, they believe that English is useful for their ruling. So they opened a channel in their empire examination, like a foreign language, and
Mm,
students who have the ability of foreign language can get an official status in the government.
mm,
This show a positive attitude, but they never like openly encourage students to learn English. But this kind
mm,
of trend and this kind of wind make made the Chinese students, and
mm,
especially students from upper classes and middle social
mm,
economic classes believe that, oh, it's time to study English, and it's time to
mm,
follow the trend of the upper class or of the empire.
mm,
And this is a good point for me to like to get a good job, or you have a rank in the government. So they began to
mm,
so they urged to learn English. However, this situation can this situation is more suitable for the time between 1860s to 1890s. And after 1890s, as we all know, the first Sino-Japan, Sino-Nippon
mm,
war happened,
mm,
and Qing government was was defeated. And during that time, the national identity of Chinese citizens were like enlightened, were so they some of the younger scholars, some of the younger elites, from their mind, so from their bottom of hearts, they began to realize, yes, English is useful for saving the country, strengthening the country.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was just, so thank you very much. I was just asking that just in relation to, you were mentioning in your third case, I think Cheeloo, was it? And you were just saying about post 1895 and 1905, this resurgence, and then there's the strike, very shortly after that. So that doesn't mean at all that it's not coming from student agency, but I was just wondering about to what extent there is that influence, there was an influence there, because I think sometimes the kind of evidence that you look at draws a map at a different scale kind of thing. So so obviously yours is more interesting in terms of like finer detail and going to primary sources, but I wonder if there's still a connection between those kind of grander narratives and the where each can complement the other rather than replace one or the other. But anyway, sorry, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually. Yeah, about the relationship between the local and the wider histories. Well, I can see that John would like to speak, but just before that, let's read Renuka's comment. She believes it was Charles Trevelyan who mentioned how little boys would wait for the steamboats that travel in the River Ganges and approach Englishmen for books or any reading material in English. And again, relating it to India, and this was going on in parallel with the ongoing Anglicist Orientalist debate in India. So she was interested to be able to relate this to the geography of opinions that you mentioned. And it was interesting how I think you mentioning the different places in India and how they were responded differently. Renuka, I don't know if you would like to expand on that, or if not.
Yes, it was this thought because my work as a research scholar is also on the history of education in India, but I place it in terms of the I approach it, you can call it as through the lens of space and place. So since I focus on specific institutions, especially University of Madras, so I was able to I quickly jump into whenever there is a word mentioning called as geography, imperial, spatial imaginaries. So it was interesting to see that certain institutions in China are also doing similar kind of work, which I was able to associate with my own work in University of Madras. So excellent work. Thank you for the talk.
Well, it's great to put you in touch. Maybe you can continue to correspond. Thank you, Renuka. John, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard, and thank you so much, Cheeloo. 非常好, as you would say in Chinese. Sheila, I've got a question about, it's a word that Richard's used in terms of debates, and on your slides you had debating societies. Now, if you think about the normal progression of a language learner, to debate requires an exceptionally high level of language competencies. My question to you is, in your research in the archives, have you got any sort of sense of what was debated? What sort of debates take place in these societies? And are these debates within the English language teaching setting, or is it something external, as in an extracurricular activity, where skills are being advanced outside of the English language classroom and done like on a club-like basis? That would interest me. And if we have time, I'll tell you why, but that's my question. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Actually, I truly encountered a lot of like debating topics among the inter colleges in St. John's and the Soochow University, and they have like kind of outlines and indicates their topics. And as I remember, one makes me like surprised is that they discussed, do you think like the Chinese Chinese soldier participate in the first World War is like a justice, it's right? Do you think it's like advantages or disadvantages? This is a debating topic yeah, during the 1914. I sorry, I forgot the specific year. And these kind of topics, and this one is makes me remember the most, like, yeah. So I believe that their topics among the higher level education, they have the ability to like truly talk about or debate about some questions and issues need a high level English competence, and not just like primary students questions. They have this kind of ability, and but these societies are all like after class clubs, even though they're like kind of truly professional, but they're not like like a curriculum to teach debating. This is a club, not just not in the course. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cheeloo. That was very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, John. So great.
I still have one sentence. Sorry. If you, I believe I took pictures and note down all of these topics, and however, I forgot like I forgot them because it's already like 3 or 4 years when I collecting the data. And if you have interesting, I can like send an email to you about these topics. Yeah, if you're interested.
I'll drop you a line, Cheeloo. I'll drop you a line. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Good. Thank you, John. And so I think Amal has just put into the chat actually that debating societies and students debating current socio-political issues was another thing that was quite widely prevalent in some Indian provinces in the 19th century. So that's one thing that's definitely come through here, and we knew this already from our when Cheeloo was at Warwick. We had Ashish was with us, and he was investigating missionary education in Travancore in India, and this is why we got together with our little group at Warwick, because of Cheeloo and Ashish looking up the similarities, differences. And I think this is something we can maybe continue to try to explore, these obviously different contexts, but interesting parallels. I don't know, Professor Chowdhury, do you want to say anything just to end, or Amal, do you want to? Would you like to just conclude? Because I think we have to finish.
Are you planning to comment or ask anything?
Well, I thought, after all, you see, it's unfortunate that we know so little about as close a neighbor as China. So I am grateful for this talk. And I was very particular that I must be here. And I find very interesting similarities between how English spread in India and how it happened in China. There are two things, perhaps, I mean, you see, in India also, the English-speaking people, I should say, came as early as the beginning of the 17th century, 1603. But it was not until the first quarter of the 19th century, which is what our speaker has also mentioned, that English became a visible presence, or let us say an audible presence in India. But then in India, within 60 years, English acquired millions of speakers, millions of people using English. One reason was that the imperial government expanded. But a more important reason, in my opinion, was the technological advances that the European quote unquote colonizers brought into India, railways, for example, required use of one language that could be understood across the length and breadth of India. Telegraph, telephone, and the British Army in India, which had tiny number of British, but many more Indians, actually 4:1 kind of Indian to the British. Now, one Indian from extreme north of India would not understand another Indian from the extreme south of India. So English and some other language that the British cooked up in India became the language of the armed forces, became the language of the administration. As a result, within 60 years, between, let us say, 1835, Macaulay's Minutes, and 1885, founding of the Indian National Congress, in flat 50 years, the number of schools, colleges, missionary schools, private colleges, the government was nowhere in it. Contrary to what people believe, that the British imposed English on India, and as this speaker has rightly noted, and Amolji, you also said, people wanted English for purely economic reasons, and that was technology. And I wish the speaker, also had dwelt upon this part of spread of English in China, or lack of spread of English in China. In a way, we admire China for having kept English to the level where it was enough. And Chinese language has grown like few Asian languages have. So to that extent, we envy you, and we congratulate the people and the government of China to have, made Chinese as good a language for technology and administration as any other. That we have not been able to do in India, unfortunately. But part of the blame for that goes to English. Because English, to that extent, has cut into domains which otherwise should have gone to Indian languages.
Yeah.
But, historically, since history is neutral, history doesn't make value judgments. It would be interesting to see what helped or did not help a spread of English in China when it happened there also at the same time. Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
You gave us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comments.
Well, thank you very much for your final words, Professor Chaudhry. Thank you also, Cheeloo. That was great. We had a really interesting discussion as well.